The early morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine floors of San Francisco International Airport's private terminal. Dr. Amara Washington walked with purpose, her heels making soft clicks against the polished marble. At 35, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had broken barriers her entire life. Her dark curly hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her navy blue business suit was perfectly pressed, a habit she'd developed during her years at MIT. The past week had been a whirlwind of meetings. As the founder and CEO of Neurotech Solutions, Amara had just finished a round of presentations to some of Silicon Valley's biggest venture capital firms. Her company's new artificial intelligence technology had impressed them all, and the numbers in her secure email proved it. $50 million in new funding was heading her way. Checking her Apple Watch, Amara saw it was 7:15 a.m. Her private jet was scheduled to depart at 8 a.m., giving her plenty of time to get through security and make a few important calls before takeoff. She adjusted the laptop bag on her shoulder, the same bag she'd carried since starting her company 5 years ago. It was a bit worn now, but she kept it as a reminder of where she'd started. Behind her walked James Chen, her chief technology officer, and Sarah Martinez, her head of operations. They were discussing the technical details of their latest AI model, their voices excited but hushed in the quiet terminal. The three of them made an impressive team, having worked together since Neurotech was just an idea in Amara's small Boston apartment. Dr. Washington, Sarah called out, quickening her pace to catch up. The development team in Boston just sent over the final test results. Everything's looking perfect for next week's launch. Amara smiled, reaching for her phone to check the results. The new AI system they'd developed could predict medical diagnoses with 99.8% accuracy, higher than any other system in the world. More importantly, it worked equally well for patients of all races and backgrounds, solving a huge problem in medical AI that had frustrated her during her years as a researcher. As they approached the security checkpoint, Amara noticed how empty the private terminal was. Only a few other passengers were present, mostly older white men in expensive suits, probably CEOs and executives heading home after their own meetings. Some were already being waved through security with quick, respectful nods from the guards. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows made the terminal look even more spacious and elegant. Amara took a deep breath, enjoying the calm before her busy day would begin. Once back in Boston, she had meetings scheduled with her engineers, a press conference about the new funding, and dinner with her mentor, Dr. Patricia Chen, the woman who'd inspired her to start this journey 15 years ago. She reached into her bag for her ID and boarding documents, already thinking about the improvements they could make with the new funding. Neurotech had grown from 3 people to over 200 employees in just 5 years. Their office, once a tiny room above a coffee shop, now occupied 3 floors of a sleek building in downtown Boston. James and Sarah were still chatting behind her as they approached the security checkpoint. Amara could see their jet through the windows, a sleek Gulfstream G650, its white paint gleaming in the morning sun. It was a recent investment, needed for their growing company's constant travel between Boston and Silicon Valley. The pilot had already started the pre-flight checks, and the ground crew was busy preparing for their departure. Amara felt a sense of pride as she watched her team and their accomplishments. From a little girl who coded her first program on a borrowed computer in her mother's kitchen to a CEO, leading one of the most innovative companies in AI, she'd come so far. But she never forgot the challenges she'd faced, the doors that had been closed, and the stereotypes she'd had to break through. That's why she'd made diversity and inclusion core values at Neurotech from day one. Little did she know, she was about to face another reminder of why her work and success mattered so much, not just for her company, but for everyone who would come after her. Robert Mills had worked as a security guard at the private terminal for 8 years. He took pride in knowing all the regular travelers, the tech executives, venture capitalists, and business leaders who passed through these exclusive gates. At 52, he believed he could spot who belonged here with just one look. Today, that belief would prove to be his biggest mistake. As Dr. Washington approached his checkpoint, Mills straightened his blue uniform and stepped forward with his hand raised. He didn't even glance at the ID she was starting to pull out. Instead, he pointed toward the main terminal building, his face set in a stern expression. Ma'am, the regular terminal is that way, he said loudly, making several nearby passengers turn their heads. This is a private terminal. His voice carried a tone that suggested he'd dealt with similar situations before, though in reality, he was the one making incorrect assumptions. Dr. Washington kept her composure, though her heart rate quickened slightly. She'd faced similar situations throughout her career, but it never got easier. Sir, I have my credentials right here, she said calmly, continuing to reach for her ID and boarding documents. But Mills stepped closer, blocking her path completely. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This area is for private jet passengers only. He emphasized each word as if speaking to someone who couldn't understand English well, despite Dr. Washington's perfect, educated speech. Behind her, James Chen and Sarah Martinez watched in disbelief. They'd seen their CEO handle difficult situations before, but this was blatant discrimination happening right in front of them. Sarah started to step forward, her face flushed with anger, but James gently held her back. They both knew Dr. Washington would handle this her way. Just then, a group of white executives walked past them. Mills barely glanced at their IDs before waving them through with a friendly smile and "Have a good flight, gentlemen." The contrast in treatment was stark and obvious to everyone watching. Sir, Dr. Washington tried again, her voice firm but professional. I am a passenger on the Neurotech Solutions private jet. She held up her ID card and boarding documents, but Mills didn't even look at them. Listen, Mills said, his voice getting louder. I don't want to have to call security. Please make your way to the main terminal. He reached for his radio, his other hand moving to rest on his security badge in what seemed like an attempt to intimidate. Other passengers had stopped to watch now. Some looked uncomfortable, others were filming with their phones, and a few were whispering among themselves. Through the terminal's glass walls, the ground crew working on Dr. Washington's jet could see the scene unfolding, and one of them hurried inside. James Chen stepped forward finally, his patience wearing thin. Excuse me, but do you realize who you're speaking to? But before he could continue, Dr. Washington raised her hand slightly, signaling him to stop. She had handled worse situations than this, and she would handle this one too. Just then, a young intern from Neurotech, Tommy Parker, came running from the direction of the jet. He was carrying a tablet and looked worried. Dr. Washington, he called out, slightly out of breath. I'm so sorry to interrupt, but the board is waiting for your video call about the Series C funding. They need your approval on the final terms. Mills's expression flickered for the first time as he heard the title Doctor and the mention of Series C funding. He looked at Dr. Washington again, this time really seeing her professional attire, her calm demeanor, and the two executives standing behind her. But before he could process this new information, another voice cut through the tense atmosphere. What's going on here? The terminal manager, David Cooper, had arrived, alerted by the growing crowd and the whispers of his staff. As he approached, his eyes widened with recognition as he looked at Dr. Washington. The situation was about to change dramatically, but the damage was already done. The videos were already being uploaded to social media, and this incident would soon become much more than just a simple misunderstanding at an airport checkpoint. David Cooper, the terminal manager, quickly assessed the situation before him. His face paled as he recognized Dr. Amara Washington, not just from her recent Forbes magazine cover, but from the airport's own VIP passenger list. This was exactly the kind of incident he had feared might happen one day. Dr. Washington, he said, stepping forward and shooting a sharp look at Mills. I sincerely apologize for this situation. Please, let me personally escort you to your aircraft. His voice carried genuine concern and embarrassment. But Dr. Washington remained where she was, her expression calm but determined. Years of breaking barriers in the tech industry had taught her that these moments, though painful, were opportunities for change. She looked directly at Mills, who was now shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot. Mr. Mills, she said, her voice clear and steady, I would like you to look at my credentials now. She held out her ID and boarding documents again. This time, Mills took them with shaking hands. As he read the documents, his face went through a series of emotions, disbelief, shock, and then deep embarrassment. Dr. Amara Washington, CEO of Neurotech Solutions. The company name alone would have been enough, but there was more. MIT doctorate, multiple technology patents, advisor to major tech companies, and recipient of the National Medal of Technology and Innovation. By now, a small crowd had gathered. James Chen and Sarah Martinez stood protectively near their CEO, while other passengers watched the scene unfold. Some had their phones out, still recording. The young intern, Tommy, looked nervous but proud to be associated with Dr. Washington. I'm sorry, Mills stammered, trying to hand the documents back. His hands were visibly shaking now. I didn't realize. That's exactly the problem, isn't it? Dr. Washington said, her voice carrying clearly through the terminal. You didn't realize because you didn't look. You didn't check. You made assumptions based on what you saw on the surface. The terminal manager stepped forward again, clearly anxious to resolve the situation. Dr. Washington, I assure you this will be dealt with immediately. We have zero tolerance for. But Dr. Washington raised her hand slightly, stopping him mid-sentence. Mr. Cooper, what we need isn't just quick discipline. What we need is systemic change. She turned to address the growing crowd. How many other qualified professionals have been turned away without even having their credentials checked? How many dreams have been delayed or denied because of assumptions? Sarah Martinez stepped forward, her tablet in hand. Dr. Washington, I've already contacted our legal team. They're standing by for your instructions. But Dr. Washington shook her head slightly. No, Sarah, we're not going to pursue legal action. She turned back to Mills and Cooper. What I want is a meeting. A meeting with your diversity and inclusion team, if you have one. And if you don't, then with whoever is responsible for training your security personnel. Mills looked up in surprise. He had expected anger, calls for his firing, perhaps even legal threats. Instead, this woman he had just discriminated against was asking for a chance to make things better. The ground crew from Dr. Washington's jet had moved closer, and one of them spoke up. Ma'am, we're ready for departure whenever you are. The respect in his voice was genuine, without a trace of the condescension Mills had shown earlier. Dr. Washington nodded, then turned to Cooper. I'll have my office contact yours this afternoon to set up that meeting. In the meantime, I hope you'll understand why I'm asking for a different security checkpoint for my team and me. As Cooper quickly led them to another security line, Dr. Washington's phone buzzed continuously. The videos were already spreading online, and news outlets were beginning to pick up the story, but she remained focused on her team and their day ahead. Before following Cooper, she turned back to Mills one last time. Mr. Mills, I hope you'll be at that meeting. Real change happens when we face our biases directly and work to overcome them. With those words, she walked away, leaving behind a silent terminal and a security guard who had just learned one of the most important lessons of his career. As Dr. Washington and her team walked through the alternative security checkpoint, the private terminal was buzzing with activity. News of the incident had spread quickly through social media, and the airport's public relations team was already scrambling to respond. But something unexpected was about to happen that would change the narrative completely. Linda Chen, a young software engineer who had been quietly watching the entire scene, stepped forward from the crowd. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her voice was clear. Dr. Washington, I'm sorry to bother you, but you're the reason I became an engineer. Dr. Washington paused and turned around. The young woman was holding a copy of last month's Tech Innovators magazine, where Dr. Washington's interview about breaking barriers in AI development had been the cover story. 4 years ago, I heard you speak at MIT, Linda continued, her voice growing stronger. You said that sometimes the biggest impact comes from the moments that challenge us the most. I've carried those words with me ever since. Other people began stepping forward too. A group of young tech professionals who had been waiting for their own flights approached. Among them was Marcus Johnson, a black startup founder who had faced similar discrimination countless times. Dr. Washington, Marcus said, my company just got its first round of funding last week. Your success story helped me keep going when investors kept turning me down. Would you mind if I shared what happened here today? People need to see this. The terminal manager, David Cooper, watched nervously as more people gathered around Dr. Washington. But instead of the angry mob he had feared, he saw something different. A community coming together, sharing stories, and supporting each other. Sarah Martinez, still holding her tablet, noticed something interesting. Dr. Washington, you need to see this, she said, showing her the screen. The videos of the incident were trending, but not with anger or calls for boycotts. Instead, people were sharing their own stories of overcoming discrimination, using the hashtag #TechIsForeveryOwn. James Chen checked his phone and smiled. The board members saw what happened. They're not just supporting your handling of the situation, they want to double our diversity initiative's budget. They're calling it the Washington Initiative. Even the other passengers who had been waived through security earlier were returning. One of them, a venture capitalist named Michael Roberts, approached Dr. Washington with respect in his eyes. "I've been investing in tech for 20 years, he said, handing her his business card. "But I've never properly considered how bias affects which founders get funding. Would you be willing to consult with our firm about improving our selection process?" The young intern, Tommy, who had been updating their social media, looked up excitedly. "Dr. Washington, tech blogs are picking up the story. But they're not focusing on the discrimination. They're highlighting your response and how you turned it into a teaching moment." Through all of this, Robert Mills stood at his security post, watching. He saw how Dr. Washington treated everyone with respect, even after what he had done. He saw how her presence commanded attention not through force or anger, but through dignity and wisdom. The pilot of Dr. Washington's jet approached, apologetically interrupting the growing crowd. "Dr. Washington, we should depart soon to maintain our flight schedule." She nodded, then turned to address everyone. "Thank you all for your support. But remember, this isn't about one incident or one person. It's about creating lasting change." She looked at Linda, the young engineer. "And it's about making sure the next generation doesn't have to face these barriers." As she finally headed toward her jet, Dr. Washington's phone buzzed with a message. It was from her mentor, Dr. Patricia Chen. "You've turned a moment of discrimination into a movement for change. This is why I always said you'd change the world." The morning sun was now high in the sky, and as Dr. Washington walked across the tarmac, her shadow stretched out behind her, just like the impact she would leave on everyone who witnessed this turning point in her journey. By the time Dr. Washington's private jet took off from San Francisco International Airport, the story had exploded across the internet. In the comfortable cabin of her Gulfstream G650, she sat with her team, watching as the incident transformed into something much bigger than herself. Sarah Martinez was monitoring social media on her tablet. "It's incredible," she said, showing the screen to Dr. Washington. "The video has over 1 million views already. But look at the comments. People aren't just angry. They're sharing resources about diversity in tech, hosting scholarship opportunities, and offering mentorship." James Chen looked up from his laptop. Major tech news websites are running the story. TechCrunch just published an article titled "Neurotech CEO Shows Leadership in Face of Discrimination." They're focusing on how you handled it. Dr. Washington took a sip of her coffee, thinking about the morning's events. Her phone had been buzzing nonstop with messages of support, but one particular message caught her eye. It was from her mother, who had worked 2 jobs to put her through college. "Amara," the message read, "when you were little, I told you that sometimes the hardest moments become our greatest opportunities to teach. Today, you proved that. I'm so proud of you." Tommy, the intern, who was still managing their social media, spoke up excitedly. "Dr. Washington, you won't believe this. Remember that coding bootcamp for underprivileged students we sponsored last year? Their applications just jumped 300% after people shared your story. Young people are saying if you could overcome these barriers, so can they." The flight attendant brought over a tablet showing live news coverage. CNN was running the story, but not as another tale of discrimination. Instead, they were highlighting Dr. Washington's achievements, her groundbreaking work in making AI more inclusive, the hundreds of jobs she created, and her company's impact on medical technology. "Look at this," Sarah said, reading from her phone. "The airport board of directors has called an emergency meeting. They're not just discussing what happened. They're reviewing their entire security training program. Your request for a meeting about systemic change is becoming reality faster than we expected." Dr. Washington smiled, remembering something her mentor, Dr. Patricia Chen, had told her years ago. Sometimes it takes one moment of truth to open 1,000 doors. Just then, James received an email that made him sit up straight. "The Silicon Valley Leadership Council wants you to give the keynote speech at next month's Tech Innovation Summit." The theme? breaking barriers in technology. They're saying your handling of today's incident embodies everything they want to discuss. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, informing them they were cruising at 40,000 feet. Through the window, Dr. Washington could see the clouds below, white and peaceful. It reminded her of how far above those clouds she had managed to rise, despite all the barriers. Sarah was still going through messages when she gasped. Dr. Washington, Robert Mills, the security guard. He's given an interview to a local news station, but it's not what you'd expect. He's openly admitting his bias and talking about how your response made him rethink everything. On her laptop, Dr. Washington pulled up the latest draft of her company's new initiative, a program to provide technology education and mentorship to underserved communities. She had been working on it for months, but now it seemed even more important. Send a message to the board, she told James. Tell them I want to double the budget for the education initiative. Today showed us that changing one mind can start a chain reaction. Imagine what we could do by changing thousands. As their jet continued its journey east, Dr. Washington opened her presentation for tomorrow's product launch. The AI medical diagnosis system they had developed was revolutionary, but today had reminded her why their work mattered beyond just technology. It wasn't just about creating smart systems, it was about creating fair ones. The revelation was clear. What had started as one guard's prejudice had become a catalyst for change, not just in one airport, but potentially across an entire industry. 1 week after the incident at San Francisco International Airport, Dr. Washington sat in her office in Boston, looking out at the city skyline. The events of that morning had set off a chain reaction that nobody had expected. On her desk lay the morning's newspapers. The Wall Street Journal had run a front-page story titled, "Tech Leaders' Response to Discrimination Sparks Industry-Wide Change." Next to it was the Boston Globe, featuring an in-depth interview with Robert Mills, the security guard who had tried to block her that day. "I've worked security for 15 years, Mills had said in the interview, but I never really understood the damage my assumptions could cause until that morning. Dr. Washington could have demanded my job. Instead, she demanded something more important, real change." Sarah Martinez knocked on the office door and entered with her tablet. "The numbers are in from our new recruitment drive," she said excitedly. "Applications from minority candidates have increased by 200% since last week. People are calling it the Washington effect." Dr. Washington smiled, remembering the young girl who had emailed her yesterday. The 12-year-old had written, "After seeing your story, I told my parents I want to study computer science. They said if you could stand up to people who tried to stop you, so can I." James Chen walked in next, carrying fresh coffee for everyone. "The airport's diversity training program starts tomorrow," he reported. "And guess what? They've asked if you would record a welcome message for the participants." Tommy, who had been promoted from intern to social media manager after his quick thinking during the incident, poked his head in. "Dr. Washington, you should see this," he said, pulling up a video on the large screen in her office. It was Robert Mills again, but this time he was speaking to a group of security personnel at a different airport. "We have to do better," he was saying. "That day taught me that our job isn't just about checking credentials, it's about treating everyone with respect and dignity." Dr. Washington's phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Just saw your old security guard on TV. You didn't just change his job, you changed his heart." The incident had affected the tech industry too. 3 major venture capital firms had announced new diversity initiatives, specifically mentioning Dr. Washington's experience as their wake-up call. One firm had even created a special fund for minority-led startups, naming it the Washington Innovation Fund. Linda Chen, the young engineer who had approached Dr. Washington at the airport, had started a mentorship program at her company. She called it Breaking Barriers and already had 50 tech leaders signed up to mentor young professionals from underrepresented groups. Looking at her calendar, Dr. Washington saw her schedule for the next month was packed with speaking engagements. Companies, universities, and organizations across the country wanted to hear not just about her AI technology, but about creating real change in their industries. "Dr. Washington," Sarah said, reading from her tablet, "the airport board wants to know if you'll lead their first diversity and inclusion workshop next month. They say your approach to the incident has become a case study in effective leadership." Just then, Dr. Washington's personal assistant brought in a letter. It was from a group of airport security guards across the country. They had started a voluntary training program, teaching their colleagues about unconscious bias and respectful treatment of all passengers. The changes are happening faster than we expected, James observed, looking at all the news coverage. People were ready for this conversation. They just needed someone to start it the right way. Dr. Washington stood up and walked to her office window. Below, she could see a group of students touring the Neurotech building. Among them were faces of all colors and backgrounds, the future of tech she had always envisioned. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from the airport's HR department, confirming next week's training session. The subject line read, "Building a better future, inspired by your leadership." The aftermath of that morning at the airport had grown into something much bigger than one incident. It had become a movement for change, spreading from one security checkpoint to boardrooms, classrooms, and beyond. 2 weeks after the airport incident, Dr. Washington stood on stage at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, her alma mater. The auditorium was packed with students, teachers, and tech industry leaders. The event wasn't planned. It had come together naturally after the viral spread of her story. "Today, we're not here to talk about what went wrong," she began, looking out at the eager faces. "We're here to talk about what we can make right." Behind her, a large screen showed images of young people from different backgrounds working on technology projects. In the front row sat Robert Mills, the security guard from the airport. He had flown in specially for this event, not as a symbol of shame, but as an example of how people could learn and change. Next to him sat Linda Chen, the young engineer who had spoken up that day at the airport. Sarah Martinez stood at the side of the stage, monitoring social media on her tablet. The hashtag #Tech4All was trending nationwide, with thousands sharing their own stories of overcoming barriers in the tech industry. "Look at these numbers," Sarah whispered to James Chen. "Over 50 companies have signed our new diversity pledge since this morning, and 15 more universities want to join our scholarship program." Dr. Washington continued her speech, her voice clear and passionate. "The response to what happened at the airport shows us something important. People want change. They're ready for it. But sometimes, they need to see what that change looks like in action." She clicked to the next slide, showing Neurotech's new initiatives. A $10 million scholarship fund for underrepresented students in STEM. Free coding boot camps in low-income communities. Mentorship programs connecting industry leaders with young professionals. New hiring practices that focused on talent rather than traditional credentials. Tommy, now running the company's social media from the back of the auditorium, posted updates live. "The responses are incredible," he texted to Sarah. "Other tech companies are announcing similar programs. It's becoming a movement." In the middle of her speech, Dr. Washington paused as her phone buzzed. It was a message from the San Francisco Airport Board. They had just approved a comprehensive new training program, making bias training mandatory for all staff. They were calling it the Washington Protocol. Robert Mills stood up when Dr. Washington invited him to speak. His voice shook slightly, but his words were sincere. "I've worked security for many years," he said, "but Dr. Washington taught me the most important lesson of my career, that real security means making everyone feel safe and respected." The audience applauded, and Dr. Washington noticed several people wiping away tears. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. It had become about everyone who had ever faced discrimination and wanted to be part of the solution. James Chen approached the podium with breaking news. Major tech companies were announcing a joint initiative to increase diversity in their leadership roles. They were pledging billions of dollars to support education and career development for underrepresented groups. Dr. Washington's mother, watching from the audience, couldn't hold back her smile. She remembered how hard her daughter had worked to get where she was, and now she was using her success to open doors for others. Near the end of the event, a young black girl raised her hand during the Q&A session. "Dr. Washington," she asked, "what should we do when people try to stop us from following our dreams?" The audience grew quiet, waiting for the answer. Dr. Washington smiled warmly at the girl. "We keep going," she said. "But more importantly, we help others go forward with us. True success isn't just about breaking through barriers. It's about holding the door open for those who come after us." As the event ended, Dr. Washington looked at the crowd of inspired faces. What had started as a difficult moment at an airport had grown into a catalyst for real change. The response wasn't just about anger or punishment. It was about education, understanding, and progress. Her phone buzzed one more time. It was a message from her mentor, Dr. Patricia Chen. You started something powerful, Amara. This is how real change happens. One moment, one person, one step at a time. 6 months after the airport incident, Dr. Washington stood in her office at Neurotech Solutions, looking at a framed newspaper article on her wall. The headline read, How One Morning Changed an Industry. But the real changes went far beyond what any headline could capture. Sarah Martinez walked in with the latest impact report. The numbers are amazing, Dr. Washington, she said excitedly. In just 6 months, our initiatives have reached over 100,000 students. The coding boot camps are running in 50 cities now. Through the glass walls, they could see the new training center that occupied the entire floor below. Young people from all backgrounds were learning coding, AI development, and technology skills. Many of them were there because of the scholarships created after that morning at the airport. James Chen joined them, carrying a letter from San Francisco International Airport. You should read this, he said, handing it to Dr. Washington. They trained over 5,000 staff members using the Washington Protocol. Complaints about discriminatory treatment are down by 85%. The letter included a note from Robert Mills, who had become an unexpected champion for change. He now led diversity training sessions at airports across the country, sharing his story and what he had learned. Dear Dr. Washington, his note read, That morning, I thought I was just doing my job. You showed me that my real job was to be better. Thank you for turning my mistake into a lesson that's helping thousands. Tommy, who had been promoted to head of community outreach, knocked on the door. You need to see this, he said, pulling up a video on his tablet. It showed a group of young black girls presenting their tech projects at a science fair. They were wearing t-shirts that read, Future Tech Leaders, part of Neurotech's new youth program. Dr. Washington's phone buzzed with a message from Linda Chen, the engineer she had met that day at the airport. Linda had just been promoted to Chief Technology Officer at her company, making her one of the few Asian women in such a high position in Silicon Valley. Your story gave me courage, Linda's message read. Now I'm making sure others have the same opportunity. The impact had spread beyond tech. Universities were changing their admission policies to be more inclusive. Companies were revising their hiring practices. Even venture capital firms were actively seeking out diverse founders to invest in. Sarah pulled up more statistics on her tablet. The Washington Innovation Fund has funded 200 startups led by underrepresented founders, she reported. 80% of them are still growing strong. We're changing the statistics, one company at a time. Dr. Washington walked to the window, looking out at the Boston skyline. She remembered something her mother had told her years ago. Success isn't just about proving them wrong, it's about making things right for those who come after you. Just then, a group of students toured the office. Among them was the young girl who had asked the question at MIT 6 months ago. She was now part of Neurotech's junior coding program, already building her first AI application. James showed Dr. Washington another email. Harvard Business School wanted to create a case study about the airport incident and its aftermath. They saw it as a perfect example of how to turn discrimination into positive change. It's not just about that one morning anymore, Dr. Washington said, looking at her team. It's about every morning that comes after, and every door that opens because of what we learned. The wall of her office now displayed photos from various initiatives, coding camps in inner-city schools, mentorship programs, leadership workshops. Each picture showed faces full of hope and determination. As the day ended, Dr. Washington received one final message. It was from a security guard at another airport. Today, I almost made the same mistake Mills did. Then I remembered your story. Instead of jumping to conclusions, I checked the credentials. The passenger was a young black woman who owns a successful tech company. Thank you for helping me see clearly. The legacy of that morning continued to grow, spreading like ripples in a pond. What started as one person being wrongly judged had become a movement that was changing lives, opening doors, and reshaping an entire industry. Dr. Washington smiled, thinking of all the future leaders who would never have to face the barriers she did. That was the real victory, not just breaking through the glass ceiling, but making sure it stayed broken for good.